She flies on a broom on Epiphany night. She rewards the good. She punishes the bad. Welcome to shadow folklore today, La Befana. The cobblestones are slick with January rain in the narrow vicoli of Rome's Trastevere quarter. The street lamps cast amber pools that fracture across wet stone, and the air smells of wood smoke and orange peel. It is late on the 5th of January, past midnight, sliding into the 6th Epiphany, the 12th night of Christmas, when the Magi are said to have reached Bethlehem. The shops are shuttered. The trattorias have gone dark. But in the windows of old apartment buildings, where laundry lines crisscross courtyards and geraniums spill from terracotta pots, children have hung stockings, coals, by the hearth, or on bedposts, or over radiators. They are waiting. Outside, the wind picks up. It carries with it the faint jangle of bells, or perhaps the scrape of something stiff brushing against tile. On the rooftops where pigeons roost and television antennas lean like skeletal trees, shadows move against the low winter clouds. The sound is rhythmic, purposeful. A broom's bristles against terracotta. A figure, small and hunched, draped in black shawls, descending chimneys with a sack slung over one shoulder. Her face is weathered, creased with age. Her hands are gnarled. She does not knock. She does not ask permission. She enters through the hearth, through cracks in shutters, through keyholes if she must, and she knows which children have been good and which have not. She is La Befana, and she has been searching for 2,000 years. La Befana belongs to Italy in a way that few other folk figures belong to a single nation. She is not imported. She is not a translation of something from elsewhere, no matter how much modern commentators have tried to fit her into the mold of Santa Claus or the Christ Child or the gift bringers of Northern Europe. She is older than those comparisons. She is rooted in the soil of the Italian peninsula, in the rhythm of its agricultural calendar, in the pre-Christian festivals that marked the turning of the year and the arrival of winter's longest nights. Her name is a corruption, or perhaps an evolution, of Epiphania, Epiphany, the Christian feast that commemorates the visit of the Magi to the infant Jesus. But her nature, her appearance, her nocturnal flight, her gifts and her punishments, all of these things reach back past the Gospels, past Rome's conversion under Constantine, into a stratum of belief that Christianity absorbed rather than erased. To understand La Befana, you must first understand the Italian landscape and the people who shaped her. Italy is a narrow boot of a country, bisected by the Apennine Mountains, bounded by the Alps to the north and the Mediterranean on three sides. Its climate varies dramatically from the alpine valleys of Alto Adige to the sun-scorched plains of Sicily. But in the central and northern regions where La Befana's legend is strongest, Tuscany, Umbria, Lazio, Emilia, Romagna, the Marche, winter is wet and cold, though rarely brutal. The land is fertile. Olive groves cling to hillsides, vineyards stripe the valleys. Villages huddle around piazzas and parish churches, their stone houses weathered to the color of honey or rust. This is not a wilderness in the North American sense. It is an inhabited landscape, one where human presence goes back millennia, where every hill has a name and every ruin a story. The people who lived here before the Christian era, the Etruscans in the north, the Umbrians and Sabines in the center, the Latins and Samnites to the south, practiced a polytheistic religion centered on household spirits, agricultural deities, and the cycles of planting and harvest. They honored lares and penates, spirits of the hearth and storeroom. They marked the winter solstice with rituals meant to coax the sun back from its lowest point, to ensure the return of light and warmth. Fires were lit. Offerings were left at crossroads. The dead were honored, for winter was the season when the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. When Rome expanded and absorbed these cultures, it brought with it a pantheon of gods borrowed from the Greeks: Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Venus, and crucially for La Befana's story, Diana. Diana, the Roman counterpart to the Greek Artemis, was goddess of the hunt, the moon, and wild places. But she was also a liminal figure, associated with crossroads, childbirth, and magic. In later Roman belief, Diana became conflated with Hecate, a goddess of witchcraft and nocturnal wanderings. By the time Christianity began to spread through the Italian peninsula in the 1st and 2nd centuries, Diana had become a figure associated with female independence, with power that existed outside the structures of patriarchy and official religion. She was worshipped in groves and at night by women who gathered in secret. The early church was not kind to Diana. Church fathers denounced her worship as demonic. In the 6th century, the Canon Episcopi, a church law that would be cited for centuries, condemned women who believed they flew through the night with Diana, riding on the backs of beasts or broomsticks, traveling great distances in the company of the goddess. The canon described this as a delusion inspired by Satan, but it acknowledged that such beliefs were widespread. Women, the text said, claimed to follow Diana, whom they also called Domina, the Lady, or Herodiana, and they believed they were called to her service, that they left their homes at night and feasted in her company. The church could denounce these beliefs, but it could not erase them. Diana the goddess became Diana the demon, then Diana the witch, and finally, Diana fragmented into countless local figures. Streg, wise women, night flyers, old crones who possessed knowledge of herbs and charms, and the secret ways of the world. In Italian folklore, particularly in rural areas, these figures retained a dual nature. They could heal or harm. They could bless a household or curse it. They moved through the night, and they were both feared and needed. La Befana inherits this lineage. She is an old woman, often described as bent and ugly, with a hooked nose and a kerchief tied around her head. She wears the black shawls of a peasant widow. She carries a broom, not as a cleaning tool but as a vehicle, and she rides it through the air on the night of Epiphany. Her legend, as it exists in its most recognizable form, is framed within Christian narrative. The Magi, traveling from the east to honor the newborn Christ, stop at her house to ask for directions. They invite her to join them on their journey to Bethlehem. She declines, saying she is too busy with her housework, that she will catch up with them later, but later never comes. The Magi do not return along the same road, and La Befana, realizing her mistake, has spent the last 2 millennia searching for the Christ child, visiting every house on Epiphany night, leaving gifts for children in the hope that one of them might be the child she seeks. This is the sanitized, sentimental version of the tale, the one told to children and printed on holiday cards. But the older layers of the story, the ones that connect La Befana to Diana, to the winter solstice, to the figure of the wandering witch, give her a sharper edge. She is not merely a gift giver, she is a judge. She rewards the good with sweets and small toys, filling their stockings with nuts, dried fruit and candy. But she punishes the bad. In older tellings, naughty children receive lumps of coal, though in some regions they receive garlic, onions, or switches. The message is clear. La Befana sees into your home. She knows your behavior. She is not bound by politeness or mercy. She is a force of accountability, and her visit is not optional. The tradition of La Befana is strongest in central and northern Italy, though it is known throughout the peninsula. In Tuscany and Umbria, she is beloved, almost a grandmother figure, despite her fearsome appearance. In Rome, La Befana's image appears in markets every January, sold as dolls and figurines, her face exaggerated into a caricature of age and ugliness. In Venice, a regatta is held in her honor, with rowers in costume racing down the Grand Canal. In smaller villages, the tradition is more intimate. Children leave wine and food for La Befana, just as they might leave cookies for Santa Claus in America, and in the morning they find their stockings filled. But La Befana is not Santa Claus. Santa is jolly, corpulent, benign. He represents abundance and capitalism, the endless supply of goods and the rewarding of consumer virtue. La Befana is spare and strange. She carries the memory of older, darker winters, when survival was uncertain, and the boundaries between the human and the uncanny were less fixed. She is both generous and severe. She is neither wholly pagan nor wholly Christian. She exists in the liminal space between traditions, a figure that Italy has kept alive precisely because she resists easy categorization. She is uniquely Italian, and yet she carries within her the echoes of beliefs that are far older than Italy itself. La Befana is, first and foremost, a woman. not a spirit or a demon in the abstract sense, but a human figure, recognizable and specific, even if her exact nature remains ambiguous. Is she a particular individual, the same woman who died 2,000 years ago? Now immortal and endlessly searching, she is both singular and plural, a particular old woman, and also the figure of the old woman as such. The crone at the edge of the village, the one who knows things that others do not. Her appearance is consistent across most tellings. She is old, very old, with a face lined and weathered by age and labor. Her nose is often described as hooked or prominent, and her chin juts forward, sometimes almost meeting her nose in the exaggerated manner of fairy tale witches. Her clothing is simple and dark, a long black dress or skirts layered one over the other, a black shawl, a kerchief or scarf tied over her hair. She is often depicted barefoot or in worn shoes. Her hands are gnarled and strong, the hands of someone who has worked all her life. She carries a broom, and this is not a detail added for whimsy. The broom is her defining attribute, as essential to her identity as a sleigh is to Santa Claus or a pitchfork is to the devil. The broom serves two purposes. It is a mundane object, the tool of a housewife, the symbol of domestic labor and the endless repetition of cleaning. But it is also a vehicle, a means of flight, and in this capacity it connects La Befana to the broader iconography of witches in European folklore. The image of the witch flying on a broomstick is now so ubiquitous that it seems almost cartoonish, but it has deep roots. In medieval and early modern Europe, witches were believed to fly to Sabbaths, nocturnal gatherings where they worshipped the devil, feasted, and performed magic. They were said to fly on broomsticks, pitchforks, or animals, anointed with flying ointments made from hallucinogenic herbs. The broom in particular had symbolic resonance. It was a tool associated with women and the home, and its transformation into a vehicle of transgression, a means by which a woman could leave the domestic sphere and travel freely through the night, was deeply threatening to a patriarchal order that sought to confine women to hearth and family. La Befana's broom does not carry the same sinister weight as the broomsticks of accused witches in the trial records. She is not traveling to a Sabbath. She is not worshipping the devil, but she is transgressing nonetheless. She is an old woman, past the age of childbearing, past the age of beauty, moving through the world alone, and at night she enters homes without permission. She makes judgments about children. She dispenses rewards and punishments according to her own criteria. She does not answer to a husband or a church authority or a civil magistrate. She is autonomous, and that autonomy, especially in a pre-modern context, is a form of power. Her behavior on Epiphany night follows a consistent pattern. She travels from house to house, descending chimneys or entering through windows, and she examines the behavior of the children within. Accounts vary on how she knows whether a child has been good or bad. In some versions, she simply knows, her knowledge a function of her supernatural or semi-divine status. In others, she carries a list, much like Santa Claus, though her list is not written on paper but remembered, a testament to her long memory and her intimate knowledge of the household she visits. For good children, she fills the kalza, the stocking hung by the hearth or near the bed, with gifts. These are not elaborate presents. They are simple, traditional sweets, dried fruit, nuts, honey candy, toroncini small nougats, and caramel hard candies. In some regions, she leaves small toys or coins. The gifts are modest, reflecting the economic reality of the peasant and working class families among whom her legend flourished. For bad children, the punishment varies by region and era. The most common gift for the naughty is coal. Though this is often now a symbolic coal, black candy shaped to resemble lumps of anthracite, which children can eat. The tradition of coal as punishment likely originates in a practical reality. Coal was a valuable commodity, a fuel for heating and cooking, and to waste it on a child who had misbehaved was a serious reprimand. But in older versions of the tale, before coal candy became commercialized, bad children might receive actual coal, or switches, or garlic and onions, things that were unpleasant but also symbolically potent. Garlic, in Italian folklore, has apotropaic properties. It wards off evil. To give it to a naughty child was to mark that child as needing protection from their own misdeeds. Onions, similarly, were associated with tears and penance. The message was not merely "you have been bad," but you must reflect on your behavior and change. Some accounts add a darker edge. In certain villages, particularly in the more remote areas of the Apennines, it was said that La Befana would take very bad children with her. This is a motif common in European folklore, the child-stealing figure. These stories served a practical purpose. Of course, they frightened children into obedience, but they also reflected deeper anxieties about the loss of children, whether to disease, accident, or the harshness of life in a pre-industrial society. La Befana, in these darker tellings, is not merely a judge, but a psychopomp, a figure who mediates between the world of the living and something beyond. Her sack is another key element of her iconography. Like Santa's bag, it is capacious, but unlike Santa's bag, which is filled only with gifts, La Befana's sack serves a dual purpose. But she scatters as she flies. In some versions, she sweeps the houses she visits, cleaning as she goes, in gesture that ties her back to her identity as a housewife, and to the deeper symbolism of the new year as a time of cleansing. In Tuscany, La Befana is often depicted as more benign, a kindly grandmother figure who might sit by the fire and rest her feet before continuing her journey. In Umbria, she is more austere, a figure to be respected rather than loved. In the south, particularly in Calabria and Basilicata, her legend blends with other folk figures, including La Strega, the witcher della Vecchia di Capodanno, the Old Woman of New Year, creating a composite figure who embodies the transition from the old year to the new. In some alpine valleys, where Italian culture meets Germanic and Celtic influences, La Befana's night flight is associated with the wild hunt, the spectral procession of the dead, and the damned that roars through the winter sky in northern European folklore. Despite these variations, certain core traits remain consistent. She is old, she is female, she flies, she judges, she rewards and punishes, and she is inextricably linked to the night of Epiphany. She is not a passive figure. She is not waiting for supplicants to come to her. She goes out into the world, and the world must reckon with her presence. In this, she stands apart from many other gift-bringing figures in European tradition, who tend to be either divine or semi-divine beings, the Christ child, Saint Nicholas, or servants of those beings, the Christkind's helpers, the elves of Santa Claus. La Befana is not serving anyone. She is following her own imperative, her own endless search, and the gifts she brings are incidental to that larger purpose. The children receive sweets or coal, but La Befana is not visiting them for their sake. She is visiting them because she is still looking, 2,000 years later, for the one child who matters. The story of La Befana's origin, as it has been told for centuries, is inseparable from the story of the Magi. The Magi, the three wise men, the three kings, though the Gospels do not call them kings, and do not specify their number, are mentioned only in the Gospel of Matthew. They come from the east, following a star to Jerusalem, where they ask King Herod where the newborn king of the Jews can be found. Herod, disturbed by this news, consults his scribes, who tell him the Magi travel to Bethlehem, find the child, and offer him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Then, warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they depart by another route. The Gospel account is sparse. It does not describe the journey in detail. It does not name the Magi or give their homeland. But over the centuries, Christian tradition elaborated on the story. By the 6th century, the Magi had been given names Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar in the Western tradition, and they had been transformed from Magodi, a term that could mean astrologers, priests of Zoroastrianism, or simply wise men, into kings. They had been assigned continents, one from Europe, one from Asia, one from Africa, a tripartite division of the known world, all paying homage to Christ. Their journey became an allegory for the Gentiles' acceptance of the gospel, the inclusion of all nations in the Christian story. In Italy, the Feast of the Epiphany, January 6th, 12 days after Christmas, celebrates the Magi's arrival in Bethlehem. It is a public holiday. It marks the end of the Christmas season, and it is on this night that La Befana flies. The legend connects her to the Magi through a simple narrative. They stopped at her house. The details vary. In some versions, they asked for directions. In others, they sought shelter for the night. But in all versions, they invited her to come with them to see the newborn king. Her response is the crux of the story. She refuses. She says she is too busy. She has housework to do, bread to bake, floors to sweep. She will come later, she says. She will join them once her chores are done. But later never comes. By the time she finishes her work, the Magi have moved on. She tries to follow them, but she does not know the way. She asks travelers, shepherds, villagers, anyone she meets, "Have you seen the Magi? Have you seen the newborn king?" No one can tell her. The star has vanished. The Magi have returned to their homelands by another route, as the Gospel says, and there is no trail to follow. And so La Befana is left searching, and she has been searching ever since. On Epiphany night, she visits every house, looking into every cradle, every bed, hoping that this time, this house, this child will be the one she seeks. She leaves gifts because she is kind, because she wants to be generous to the children she meets, even if they are not the child she is looking for. But her true purpose is the search itself, an endless, hopeless quest for a moment she missed 2,000 years ago. This story, in its sentimentality, has a certain pathos. La Befana becomes a tragic figure, a woman punished not for wickedness, but for a single moment of hesitation, a choice to prioritize the mundane over the miraculous. It is a story about regret, about the weight of a decision that cannot be undone, about the way a single no can echo across a lifetime. It is also, not incidentally, a story about the costs of domestic labor, but this Christian framing, poignant as it is also a late addition. A way of integrating an older figure into the church calendar, the connection to the Magi, to Epiphany, to the search for Christ. These elements were likely grafted onto La Befana's legend sometime in the Middle Ages, after the Feast of the Epiphany had become a major liturgical celebration. The older stratum of the story has nothing to do with the Magi. It is about a different kind of wandering, a different kind of search. In pre-Christian Italian belief, the turn of the year was a time when the dead walked. The 12 days of Christmas, the period from December 25th to January 6th, were liminal, outside normal time. They were dangerous. The boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead, the world of the human and the world of the spirit, grew thin. To protect the household, to ward off malevolent spirits, and to honor the ancestor, doors were marked with signs of protection. La Befana, in this older context, is not searching for Christ. She is one of the wandering figures of the winter nights, a spirit or a woman or something in between, moving through the darkness. She visits homes, but her visit is not primarily about gifts. It is about inspection, about ensuring that the household is in order, that the proper rituals have been performed, that the transition from the old year to the new is being properly observed. Her gifts and punishments are a form of judgment, but the judgment is not merely moral. It is also about whether the household has fulfilled its obligations to the unseen world. This reading connects La Befana more directly to Diana and to the nocturnal processions described in the Canon Episcopi. Diana's followers, according to medieval accounts, believed they traveled through the night in a great company, led by the goddess, visiting households and consuming the food left out for them. If the household had left offerings, they were blessed with prosperity. If the household was stingy or inhospitable, they were cursed. La Befana's night flight, her entry into homes, her rewards and punishments, all echo this pattern. She is a solitary figure rather than part of a procession, but she fulfills the same function. She is a representative of the other world, and her visit is a test. The transformation of La Befana from a pre-Christian spirit or goddess, associated figure into a Christian character searching for the Christ child, is an example of a process that occurred across Europe. The church could not eliminate popular beliefs, so it reinterpreted them. Pagan festivals became saints' days. Goddesses became saints or demons. Rituals of propitiation were reframed as acts of Christian charity. La Befana. In the Italian countryside where folk memory is long, La Befana retained her edge. She was not merely a tragic grandmother. She was still the old woman who could curse as well as bless, who flew through the night on a broom, who saw into your home and knew your secrets. She was still a figure of power, and that power was respected, even if the story told about her had changed. There is also the question of her name. La Befana is almost certainly a corruption of Epifania, the Italian word for epiphany. The linguistic shift is straightforward. Epifania becomes Befania in dialect, which becomes Befana. But this linguistic origin does not explain why the figure associated with Epiphany became an old woman on a broomstick, rather than, say, the Magi themselves, or an angel, or the Christ child. The name attached itself to a figure who was already present in folk tradition, a figure who was already associated with the turning of the year and the giving of gifts. The Christian feast provided a new date, a new name, a new story. But the figure herself is older. Some scholars have also noted a possible connection to the Roman festival of Saturnalia, which took place in late December, and to the figure of Strinia, a Sabine goddess associated with the new year and the giving of gifts. Strinia's name survives in the Italian word strena, which means gift or present, particularly a gift given at New Year. The connection is speculative, but it is suggestive. If La Befana has roots in Strinia, then she represents a very ancient tradition indeed, a goddess of renewal and gift, giving who predates Rome itself. What is not speculative is that La Befana occupies a unique position in Italian folklore. She is neither purely pagan nor purely Christian. She is both. She exists in the space where those two traditions meet and merge, where an old woman with a broom can be both a penitent seeking Christ and a representative of pre-Christian powers, where a gift of sweets can be both an act of kindness and a form of judgment. She is a living fossil, a remnant of beliefs that Europe has otherwise largely forgotten, and Italy has kept her alive precisely because she serves needs that neither Christianity nor modernity have entirely replaced. She is a figure of female authority, of judgment, of the uncanny, and of the domestic. She is the old woman who flies. The story of how La Befana was perceived, interpreted, and reshaped by outsiders is inseparable from the broader history of how Italian folklore was studied, catalogued, and misunderstood by scholars and travelers from outside the peninsula. Italy, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, was a destination for the Grand Tour, a place where educated Northern Europeans and Americans came to study classical ruins, Renaissance art, and the supposed remnants of ancient culture. But alongside the high culture of Rome and Florence, there existed a robust folk culture, particularly in rural areas. And this folk culture fascinated and sometimes alarmed the visitors who encountered it. The study of folklore as an academic discipline emerged in the 19th century, part of the broader Romantic movement's interest in national identity, folk traditions, and the authentic culture of the common people. In Italy, early folklorists like Giuseppe Pietrafei, who published his monumental Biblioteca delle Tradizioni Popolari Siciliane, Library of Sicilian Folk Traditions between 1871 and 1913, documented customs, songs, stories, and beliefs from across the country. Pietrafei's work on La Befana and similar figures was largely descriptive. He recorded the traditions as they existed without imposing a heavy interpretive framework, though he did note connections to pre-Christian beliefs and to the figure of Diana. But foreign scholars often approached Italian folklore with a more condescending eye. James George Fraser, the Scottish anthropologist, whose The Golden Bough was published in multiple volumes between 1890 and 1915, drew heavily on Italian examples to construct his theory of religion as an evolutionary progression from magic to religion to science. Fraser saw Italian folk practices, the veneration of local saints, the rituals surrounding harvest and planting, the fear of the evil eye, as survivals of primitive belief systems, relics of an earlier stage of human development. He was fascinated by the way Christian saints had taken on the attributes of pagan gods, and he noted the figure of La Befana as an example of this process. but his framework was one of progress and modernization. He assumed that these beliefs would eventually disappear as Italy became more educated and industrialized. The Italian anthropologist and folklorist Ernesto de Martino, writing in the mid-20th century, took a different approach. De Martino, influenced by Marxism and existentialism, argued that folk beliefs were not primitive relics, but rather rational responses to the precarity and suffering of peasant life in southern Italy. His work, particularly Sud e Magia, The Southern Magic, published in 1959, examined magical practices and beliefs not as superstitions to be overcome, but as systems of meaning that provided agency and structure in a world of poverty, illness, and political powerlessness. De Martino did not write extensively about La Befana, but his approach, taking folk belief seriously on its own terms, represented a shift in how Italian folklore was studied. For foreign travelers and writers, La Befana was often treated as a curiosity, a quaint example of Italian superstition. In the early 20th century, English and American travel writers describing their visits to Italy during the Christmas season would often mention the Epiphany tradition. They described the markets in Rome's Piazza Navona, where La Befana dolls were sold alongside toys and sweets, and they noted the excitement of Italian children awaiting her visit. But their accounts often had a tone of bemused condescension. La Befana was charming, picturesque, but also vaguely absurd, a relic of a less enlightened age. She was not taken seriously as a religious or cultural figure, in the way that, say, Santa Claus was in their own countries. This double standard is worth noting. Santa Claus, by the early 20th century, had been thoroughly commercialized and sanitized in the United States and much of Northern Europe. His origins in Saint Nicholas of Myra, a 4th century bishop, known for his generosity to the poor, had been largely forgotten. He had been transformed into a jolly secular figure, a symbol of consumer capitalism and the commercial Christmas. But he was still treated with a certain reverence. He was ours, and therefore he was legitimate. La Befana, by contrast, was theirs, and therefore she was exotic, strange, a holdover from a Catholic country that had not fully embraced modernity. The Catholic Church's attitude toward La Befana has been complicated. On one hand, the Church has endorsed the Epiphany tradition and the story that connects La Befana to the Magi. A legend, in its Christian framing, it emphasizes the importance of the Epiphany, the inclusion of the Gentiles in the Christian story, and the idea of seeking Christ. On the other hand, the Church has been wary of La Befana's older, more pagan aspects, her identity as a witch. Like figure, her association with magic and the uncanny. In some periods and regions, priests have discouraged the tradition, arguing that it distracts from the true meaning of Epiphany, or that it perpetuates superstition. But the Church has never been able to fully suppress La Befana, and in practice, many Italian clergy have tacitly accepted her. In the 20th century, it became common for parishes to hold Epiphany celebrations, where a woman dressed as La Befana would distribute sweets to children after Mass. This domestication of the figure, bringing her into the church, making her an official part of the celebration, rather than a nocturnal intruder, is another example of the Church's strategy of absorption. If you cannot eliminate a tradition, you incorporate it, and in the process you sanitize it, stripping away the elements that are too dangerous or too pagan. The fascist regime under Benito Mussolini, which governed Italy from 1922 to 1943, also took an interest in La Befana, though for different reasons. Mussolini's government sought to promote a unified Italian national identity, and folk traditions like La Befana were seen as useful tools for this project. The regime encouraged Epiphany celebrations, particularly in schools, where children would receive gifts from La Befana as part of organized events. But the fascists also sought to modernize Italy and to break the hold of what they saw as backward, rural superstitions. The result was a tension. La Befana was promoted as a national symbol, but she was also policed, her rougher edges smoothed away, her image made safe and patriotic. After World War II and the fall of fascism, La Befana experienced a revival in the 1950s and 1960s. As Italy underwent rapid industrialization and urbanization, there was a nostalgic turn toward folk traditions, seen as embodiments of an authentic Italian identity that was being lost in the rush toward modernity. La Befana became a symbol of this lost world, a figure of memory and continuity. At the same time, she was increasingly commercialized. La Befana dolls, La Befana candy, La Befana greeting cards. The commercialization mirrored what had happened with Santa Claus in the United States, but it also provoked debate. Was La Befana being preserved, or was she being turned into a hollow commodity? In recent years, La Befana has become a site of political and cultural controversy. In January 2019, the mayor of Treviso, a city in the Veneto region, announced that the municipality would no longer fund a traditional Epiphany celebration featuring La Befana. The stated reason was budgetary, but the decision was framed by some commentators as part of a broader effort to secularize public life and to remove religious or folk traditions from official events. The decision sparked protests from residents who saw the elimination of the La Befana celebration as an attack on local tradition and identity. The controversy highlighted the way that folk figures like La Befana have become entangled in larger debates about secularism, multiculturalism, and the role of tradition in contemporary Italian society. The international perception of La Befana has also shifted. In the English-speaking world, she was virtually unknown until the late 20th century. Italian immigrants to the United States and Canada brought the tradition with them, and in Italian-American communities, La Befana has been kept alive, though often in a diminished form, overshadowed by the dominant culture's focus on Christmas and Santa Claus. In recent decades, however, there has been a growing interest in diverse cultural traditions, and La Befana has been discovered by non-Italian audiences. She has appeared in children's books, in articles about world Christmas traditions, and in holiday decorations. But this popularization has often come with simplification. La Befana is presented as Italy's Santa Claus, a witch who brings gifts without much attention to the deeper layers of her story or the cultural context that produced her. What is lost in this translation is the ambiguity, the strangeness, the way La Befana resists easy categorization. She is not simply a gift giver. She is not simply a Christian figure or a pagan remnant. She is both and neither. She is a woman who made a mistake 2,000 years ago, but she is also a goddess, a witch, a representative of winter and the turning of the year. She is kind and she is severe. She is domestic and she is transgressive. She is the old woman sweeping the hearth and the old woman flying through the night. To flatten her into a mere equivalent of Santa Claus is to miss the point entirely. The documented history of La Befana is elusive in a way that the histories of many folk figures are. She does not appear in court records or witch trial transcripts. She was not hunted or burned at the stake. She was not, as far as the historical record shows, ever treated as a literal entity whose existence needed to be proven or disproven. Instead, she existed as a tradition, a practice, something that families and communities did on Epiphany night. The evidence for La Befana is not in the form of sightings or encounters, but in the form of customs, material culture, and the persistence of belief across generations. The earliest written references to La Befana as a figure associated with Epiphany appear in Italian folk collections from the 19th century, though the tradition itself is clearly much older. Giuseppe Pietrafei, in his work on Sicilian folklore published between 1871 and 1913, documented Epiphany customs across Sicily, though he noted that the figure of La Befana was less prominent in the south than in central and northern Italy. In Sicily, the Epiphany was more closely associated with the Magi themselves, and gifts were often attributed to the three kings rather than to an old woman. But Pietrafei did record the belief, in some Sicilian communities, that a nocturnal figure visited homes on Epiphany night, and that this figure was sometimes called La Vecchia, the old woman. In central Italy, particularly in Rome, Florence, and the surrounding regions, the tradition was more robust. The Epiphany markets in Rome's Piazza Navona have been documented since at least the 17th century. These markets sold toys, sweets, and figures of La Befana, and they were a major social event, drawing crowds from across the city. Travelers' accounts from the 18th and 19th centuries describe the scene. Stalls lit by torches, vendors hawking their wares, children clutching La Befana dolls made of cloth or papier. Mumfeish, their faces painted with exaggerated features, hooked noses, pointed chins, kerchiefs tied tightly. The dolls themselves are a form of documentation. The oldest surviving La Befana dolls, housed in folk museums in Italy, date from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Though the tradition of making such dolls is certainly older, these dolls were not merely decorative. They were part of the ritual. Families would place a La Befana doll near the hearth or hang it from the ceiling, a physical representation of the figure who would visit that night. Some dolls were elaborate, with detailed clothing and accessories. Others were simple, made from scraps of fabric and straw. All of them shared the same basic features: an old woman's face, a broom, a sack. In rural areas, particularly in the Apennine villages, the tradition took on a more performative dimension. In some communities, a woman, often an older woman, someone past childbearing age, would dress as La Befana on Epiphany Eve. She would go from house to house, carrying a broom and a sack, and she would enter homes where she was invited. Children would sing songs to her or recite prayers, and she would distribute sweets and small gifts. If a child had misbehaved, she would scold them, sometimes with surprising severity. This was not merely theater. It was a ritual, a way of making La Befana present, of giving her a physical form and allowing her to perform her role as judge and gift. Giver photographs from the early 20th century show these performances. In one image, taken in a village in Umbria in 1923, a woman dressed as La Befana stands in a doorway, her face shadowed by a kerchief, a broom in one hand and a sack in the other. Children crowd around her, some eager, some wary. The photograph is grainy, but the expressions are clear: anticipation, nervousness, the thrill of an encounter with something that is both familiar and strange. The tradition of leaving food and wine for La Befana is also well documented. On Epiphany Eve, families would set out a plate of food, bread, cheese, fruit, and a glass of wine near the hearth or by the door. In the morning, the food and wine would be gone, consumed by La Befana during her visit. In practice, of course, the food was often eaten by the adults of the household, a small ritual deception that maintained the magic for the children. But the gesture itself was significant. It was an offering, a sign of hospitality, and it connected the family to a larger pattern of ritual exchange. You gave to La Befana, and she gave to you. You honored her, and she blessed your household. There are also records of La Befana songs and rhymes, passed down orally and later transcribed by folklorists. One traditional rhyme, still recited by Italian children, goes: La Befana, vien di not con la sca, tut rota, col vestito, alla romana, viva viva, La Befana. La Befana comes at night, fey, with her shoes, all tattered, fey, in a Roman style dress, fey, long live La Befana. Another version, more elaborate, includes a warning: se sei stato cattivello, la carbonella troverai, ma se sei stato tanto buono tanti dolci mangerai. If you've been naughty, fey, you'll find coal, fey, but if you've been very good, fey, you'll eat many sweets. These rhymes served multiple functions. They taught children about La Befana's expectations. They reinforced the moral framework of reward and punishment, and they kept the tradition alive through repetition, embedding La Befana in the rhythms of childhood. In the 20th century, as literacy spread and mass media became more prevalent, La Befana moved from oral tradition into print and visual culture. Children's books featuring La Befana began to appear in the 1920s and 1930s. These books often presented a softened, sentimentalized version of the character, emphasizing her kindness and downplaying her severity. Illustrations showed her as a kindly grandmother rather than a fearsome crone, though she still carried her broom and her sack. The books were popular, and they helped to standardize the image of La Befana across Italy, reducing regional variation in favor of a single recognizable character. Newspapers also documented La Befana's continued presence in Italian life. Articles from the 1950s and 1960s describe Epiphany celebrations in schools and parishes. with children performing plays about La Befana's meeting with the Magi. Photographs show classrooms decorated with La Befana dolls and drawings. In Rome, the Piazza Navona market continued to thrive, and newspapers reported on the crowds, the sales figures, the police presence needed to manage the throngs. But there were also signs of change. As Italy modernized and American cultural influence grew, Santa Claus began to encroach on La Befana's territory. Department stores in Milan and Rome introduced Santa Claus figures in the 1960s, and Christmas decorations began to feature red-suited Santas alongside La Befanas. Some Italian families began celebrating Christmas with gifts on December 25th, rather than waiting for Epiphany. In the 1970s and 1980s, there was a conscious effort by cultural organizations and local governments to preserve and promote La Befana as a distinctly Italian tradition. Festivals were organized. La Befana parades were held in cities and towns across Italy. In Venice, the Regatta della Befana, a boat race featuring rowers dressed as La Befana, was revived as an annual event on Epiphany Day. These efforts were partially successful. La Befana remained a living tradition, but she also became something of a museum piece, a symbol of Italian identity that was increasingly performed for tourists and nostalgic adults rather than genuinely believed in by children. One in particularly well-documented case of La Befana's cultural persistence comes from the town of Urbania in the Marche region. Since 1950, Urbania has hosted an annual Festa Nazionale della Befana, National Befana Festival, every January. The festival includes parades, performances, competitions for the best La Befana costume, and a ceremonial arrival of La Befana, who descends from the town's clock tower on a rope, flying on her broom. The festival attracts thousands of visitors each year, and it has been documented in numerous newspaper articles, television reports, and academic studies. It is a living example of how folk traditions can be preserved through institutionalization, though the question of whether the festival represents genuine belief or merely cultural performance remains open. The tradition of La Befana has also been documented in the Italian diaspora. Italian immigrants to the United States, Canada, Argentina, and other countries brought the tradition with them, and in some communities, La Befana has been kept alive for generations. In New York's Little Italy, for example, Epiphany celebrations featuring La Befana were held throughout the 20th century, though they have declined in recent decades as the neighborhood's Italian population has dispersed. In Toronto, the Italian Cultural Center has hosted La Befana events since the 1970s, with volunteers dressing as La Befana to distribute gifts to children. What these documented cases reveal is that La Befana is not a static figure. She has evolved, adapted, and persisted through changing social, economic, and cultural conditions. She has moved from oral tradition to print to mass media. She has been commercialized, institutionalized, and preserved as heritage. She has traveled from Italy to the diaspora and back again. And through all of this, she has remained recognizable. An old woman, a broom, a sack, a night flight, gifts and coal. The specific meanings attached to her have shifted, but the core iconography has endured. La Befana's entry into popular culture beyond the folk traditions of Italy has been a gradual and uneven process. Unlike figures like Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny, which were aggressively commercialized and exported across the globe, La Befana remained largely confined to Italian culture until the late 20th century. But within Italy, and eventually in international contexts, she has appeared in literature, film, television, and other media. And each appearance has both reflected and shaped her evolving image. One of the earliest literary treatments of La Befana appears in the work of Giovanni Pascoli, one of Italy's most celebrated poets. Pascoli, writing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, drew heavily on folk traditions and rural life in his poetry. In his poem La Befana, published in 1897 as part of the collection Mirasay, Pascoli presents the figure as a benign, almost melancholic presence. She is tired, ancient, moving slowly through the night. She is pitiable, a figure of endless longing and endurance. The poem reflects the romantic interest in folk culture and the sentimental reinterpretation of folk figures that was common in the literature of that era. In children's literature, La Befana began to appear more frequently in the early 20th century, such as La Befana, Aiswasi Doni. These books emphasized the importance of good behavior and the rewards that came from obedience and kindness. La Befana was portrayed as a kindly old woman, more grandmother than witch, and the darker elements of her legend, the cold, the punishment, the possibility of being taken away, were minimized or eliminated. This sanitization mirrored broader trends in children's literature, which in the early 20th century was increasingly didactic and protective, seeking to shield children from frightening or morally ambiguous content. By the mid-20th century, La Befana had become a staple of Italian children's culture. She appeared in comic books, in radio programs, and eventually on television. Italian state television, RAI, produced Epiphany specials featuring La Befana from the 1960s onward. These programs typically included a mixture of entertainment, songs, skits, puppet shows, and instruction, with La Befana teaching children about generosity, honesty, and respect. The programs were popular, and they helped to consolidate La Befana's image in the national consciousness. She was no longer a regional or local figure. She was a national symbol, recognizable from the Alps to Sicily. La Befana's first major appearance in cinema came with the Italian film La Befana Viene di Notte, directed by Michel Servi and released in 2018. The film is a fantasy adventure aimed at a family audience. It presents La Befana not as an old woman, but as a title, a role passed down through generations. The protagonist is a teacher who discovers she is the latest in a line of Befanas and must take up the mantle to save Epiphany from a villainous former Befana. The film takes significant liberties with the traditional legend. La Befana is no longer a solitary tragic figure. She is part of a secret society, a guardian of childhood and wonder. The broom is no longer just a broom, it is a magical artifact. The film was moderately successful in Italy and received a sequel in 2021. But it represents a dramatic departure from the folk tradition. La Befana has been transformed into a superhero, a fantasy character shaped by the conventions of contemporary children's cinema. This transformation is emblematic of a broader pattern in how folk figures are adapted for modern media. The original context, the agricultural calendar, the pre-Christian beliefs, the moral framework of a specific culture is stripped away, and the figure is reduced to its most visually distinctive elements. In La Befana's case, the broom, the sack, the flying, and then rebuilt as a generic fantasy character. What is gained is accessibility and spectacle. What is lost is meaning. La Befana has appeared in a handful of English-language children's books. Books such as The Legend of La Befana by Tommy de Paula, published in 1980, introduced La Befana to an American audience. De Paula's version is sympathetic and sentimental, emphasizing La Befana's kindness and her endless search for the Christ child. The illustrations are colorful and accessible, and the text is simple. The book has been widely used in American schools to teach about Epiphany and Italian culture, though it has also been critiqued for presenting a flattened, overly sweet version of the legend. In recent years, La Befana has also appeared in video games, particularly mobile games and browser-based games aimed at children. These games typically cast the player as La Befana, or as a helper to La Befana, and the gameplay involves delivering gifts, avoiding obstacles. The games are simple and inoffensive, and they further the commercialization and sanitization of the figure. La Befana becomes a brand, a character to be licensed and marketed, no different from any other children's media property. The evolution of La Befana in popular culture follows a predictable arc. She begins as a complex, ambiguous figure, rooted in a specific cultural and religious context. As she is adapted for a broader audience, particularly for children, the complexity is reduced. The darker elements, the punishment, the judgment, the pre-Christian associations, are removed or softened. The figure becomes more benign, more universal, more marketable. By the time she appears in video games and merchandise, she has become a generic symbol of giving, no longer tied to Epiphany, or to Italy, or to the deeper meanings that once defined her. But even as La Befana has been commercialized and simplified, the older tradition has persisted. In Italy, particularly in rural areas and in families that maintain folk practices. La Befana remains a more ambiguous, more powerful figure. She is not merely a character in a storybook. She is still the old woman who flies through the night, who enters your home, who knows whether you have been good or bad. The dual existence, La Befana as a sanitized media character and La Befana as a living folk figure, creates a tension, which is the real La Befana. The answer perhaps is both. Folk figures have always been mutable, shaped by the needs and imaginations of the people who tell their stories. La Befana in a video game and La Befana in a village in Umbria are not the same, but they are both descendants of the same tradition, branches of the same story. What is notable is that La Befana has not been fully absorbed into the global, Americanized Christmas commercial complex in the way that other figures have. She remains distinctly Italian. Her name is not translated. Her story is not widely known outside Italian communities. She has not become a universal symbol in the way that Santa Claus has. This is partly a function of timing and geography. Italy was not a cultural exporter in the 20th century in the way that the United States was. But it is also a function of her nature. La Befana is too strange, too specific, too rooted in a particular time and place to be easily universalized. She resists the flattening that global consumer culture demands, and in that resistance, there is something to be celebrated. La Befana in the 21st century is a figure caught between worlds. She exists in the realm of folklore and tradition, a living link to pre-Christian beliefs and to the rhythms of agricultural life that shaped Italian culture for millennia. But she also exists in the realm of commerce and spectacle, a marketable icon, a brand, a character to be deployed in children's media and tourist festivals. The question of what La Befana means now, in an Italy that is urbanized, secular, and deeply integrated into the global economy, is not easily answered. But it is worth asking. But to understand La Befana's contemporary significance is to see her as a metaphor for continuity in the face of change. Most Italians now live in cities. The church, while still influential, no longer has the totalizing hold on culture that it once did. Secularization, individualism, and consumer capitalism have reshaped daily life. And yet La Befana persists. Families still hang stockings on Epiphany Eve. Markets still sell La Befana dolls. The tradition endures. Even if its meaning has shifted, this persistence suggests that La Befana fulfills needs that are not entirely rational or explicable in economic terms. She offers in a globalized world where local traditions are often swamped by international consumer culture. La Befana is a marker of Italian-ness, a way of asserting that Italy is not merely a province of American or global culture, but has its own stories, its own symbols, its own ways of marking time and celebrating the year's turning. She is a form of cultural resistance, however small. But La Befana also functions as a metaphor for the way that women, particularly older women, are perceived and treated in contemporary society. La Befana is old, ugly, and powerful. She does not apologize for her appearance. She does not seek to be beautiful or desirable. She exists outside the economy of youth and beauty that governs so much of how women are valued. And yet she is revered, or at least respected. She has authority. She makes judgments. She dispenses justice. In a culture that often renders older women invisible, La Befana is a figure of visibility and agency. This reading of La Befana as a feminist icon is not universally accepted. Some feminists have argued that La Befana, in her ugliness and her association with housework, reinforces negative stereotypes about women. She is the crone, the witch, the old woman alone and marginalized. Her story, in its Christian framing, is one of regret and missed opportunity. A cautionary tale about the costs of prioritizing domestic labor over participation in the larger world. And there is truth in this critique. La Befana is not an unambiguously empowering figure. She carries the weight of centuries of misogyny, of fears about female power, of the ways that women who did not conform to expectations were demonized and ostracized. But the older layers of the story, the pre-Christian layers, offer a different perspective. In those layers, La Befana is not a woman who made a mistake. She is a representative of powers that exist outside patriarchal control. She is Diana, the goddess who refused marriage. She is the witch who flies through the night, who gathers with other women, who possesses knowledge that men do not. She is the old woman who is no longer subject to the rules that govern younger women. The rules of marriage, childbearing, sexual availability. She has passed through those stages. And she has gained a different kind of freedom. She is no longer bound to the household in the way that a young mother is. She can leave. She can fly. This freedom is both exhilarating and terrifying. It is the freedom of the outsider, the one who is no longer needed or wanted in certain ways, and who can therefore act without the constraints of social expectation. It is the freedom that comes with age and with the loss of certain kinds of power, but the gaining of others. La Befana, in this reading, is not a figure of defeat, but of transformation. A woman who has moved beyond the roles assigned to her and has claimed a space of her own. La Befana can also be understood as a metaphor for the search for meaning in a world that often seems empty of it. Her story, in its Christian framing, is about a search for the divine, for the Christ child, for a moment of transcendence that she missed and can never recover. She is searching, always searching, and she will never find what she seeks. This is, in one sense, a tragic story, but it is also a story about the importance of the search itself, about the way that meaning is found not in the destination, but in the act of looking. In a secular, postmodern context, La Befana's search can be reinterpreted as a search for purpose, for connection, for something beyond the mundane. She is the figure of existential longing, the one who knows that what she seeks may not exist, but continues to search anyway, because the alternative, to stop, to give up, to accept the emptiness, is intolerable. She is, in this sense, a profoundly modern figure, a representation of the human condition in an age that has lost its certainties, but not its need for meaning. There is also an environmental dimension to La Befana's story. She is connected to the cycles of the year, to the winter solstice, to the turning of the season. She arrives at Epiphany, the end of the Christmas season, the moment when the year begins to tilt back toward light. She is a figure of renewal and cleansing, sweeping away the old year to make way for the new. In a time of ecological crisis, when the natural cycles that have governed human life for millennia are being disrupted by climate change, La Befana can be read as a reminder of what is being lost. She represents a way of life that was attuned to the rhythms of the earth, that marked time by harvests and festivals, rather than by the relentless forward march of industrial capitalism. Her persistence is a form of memory, a refusal to let that older way of life be completely forgotten. But perhaps the most important thing about La Befana in the end is that she is strange. She does not fit comfortably into modern categories. She is not quite a saint and not quite a witch. She is not quite benevolent and not quite malevolent. She is both Christian and pagan, both domestic and wild, both a figure of comfort and a figure of judgment. She resists simplification. She refuses to be turned into something safe and predictable. And in a world that constantly seeks to flatten complexity, to reduce everything to easily marketable narratives, La Befana's strangeness is a gift. She flies on a broom on Epiphany night. She has been flying for 2,000 years, and she will continue to fly, searching for something she will never find, leaving gifts for children who may or may not believe in her, sweeping the hearths of a world that has largely forgotten why hearths matter. She is the old woman at the edge of the story, the one who does not belong in the brightly lit center. She is La Befana, and she is still here, still strange, still flying. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more folklore myths and mysterious creatures. See you next time.